Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward. All right, welcome everyone. Today we have with us Diana Montalion, and you were introduced to us through Andrew Harmel, one of our friends who's been up here many times. And we had him on the podcast at least once, and he knows the smartest people. He himself is also really smart, but he just knows the most interesting, smart people. And so that's how we got introduced to Diana. So welcome. Great to have you, Diana.
Thank you. We have to hurry so I can get into Discord and tell Andrew that this is what you said about him. It will just make his day.
Yeah, well, he's also struggling with similar things that I've been, and I think you've been in our different ways. Just how do we make work not suck, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. We maybe in the first half of life, we don't know that it downsides.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's just the way it is.
This is how the world works.
And then you're in it long enough, and then
you go, wait a minute,
this isn't what
really, this doesn't feel right. Feels like we're doing it wrong. Yeah.
So Diana, tell us about yourself and tell us about the book that you have written that is nearly published.
So it's funny because you're talking about this, and I think, I started in a keynote that I did recently, really focusing on how when you've been around long enough, you see that things don't really change. We're very trendy in tech. Like we don't think of ourselves as, fashion conscious or anything, but man, we love to love something, then we love to hate it, then we love to fight about it. But in the end, the problems tend to just resurface, right? As Pirsig says, that if a factory is torn down, but the rationality that built the factory remains, then you'll just build another factory.
You're quoting Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yes.
We were talking about
really
books
true.
earlier.
Yeah. Right? It's like we change our JavaScript frameworks monthly. They come in and out of fashion pretty weekly, daily, so fast. It's really interesting because the core kind of philosophies really have not changed in 20 years around any of that stuff. So,
or it resurfaces.
Different patterns.
Same in, living in this country and in the world, that, this isn't unique to us. I think when I was younger, it feels new. And then as you get a bit older, it feels like different conversation, same point, right?
Yeah. I think it's like what we were talking about last week with taking a complex problem and trying to solve it using things that you would solve a complicated problem with. So complex being stuff that you can't quite, you just get trends. You can't really predict the weather or whatever. But we go, okay, what are all the rules here that we use to, write a computer program or fix a watch or whatever? And it's like, it's complicated, but you know how to you know that you can come up with a set of rules, and then you go, oh, I like this feeling of control, so let's apply it everywhere. And it doesn't, like when you're dealing with people.
Right. And increasingly with software systems that, we used to just to the point of introduction, right? I was a back-end engineer, and we put a lot of custom code into a monolithic piece of software to add features. So I joke, it's not a joke, that I helped build the monoliths, and now I'm helping to unbuild the monoliths.
Deconstruct the monoliths.
Yeah, but that's okay, right? That's paradigms are shifting. But as relational complexity was increasing, as I work predominantly in information and knowledge systems, and that it used to be that, for example, you would create a print magazine. This is I use in my workshops when I teach, I use a fictitious company, and this is part of their challenge. You had a print magazine, then you had a website, and that was like a house you built and invited everyone over. And there's that little Python script, or maybe it's not even, maybe it's it could be ball, little script that moves it from the old big software to the new digital presence, and no one knows who wrote it. And if it broke, everything would break, kind of thing. But now, where everything is so interrelated that information completely depends on the context the consumer is in when they're relating to the information. This completely shifts what we think of in terms of choreography of systems. It means that Donella Meadows said that, we think that we understand two because we know one and one make two, but we forget that we also have to understand and that increasingly I was part of big digital transformation, and they were like the Titanic, right? They hit an iceberg and sunk, and all the sea levels are gone. And it's just not obviously what the intention was. And so, as I was doing more and more, as my responsibilities were increasing, I say, but it's kind of true that, I became a systems architect because I had to, like for survival, that, now relationships and patterns and structures, these things were all just as much a part of the outcome
Mm.
as feature driven
The code,
engineering,
yeah.
yeah, it used to be. And
So
I
you
became
had to look at things in this more holistic way and discover the relationships between the people and the processes and the code and all the different parts of this very complex system to be able to have successful outcomes.
Is that how you define an architect?
we're going right there. We'll go right there. So so first I want to say I'm really tired and frustrated with the argument about what architect means. I feel like we get stuck on words. Back in 2019, I gave a talk at the O'Reilly Architecture Conference, and there's like half of the room is architecture is Kubernetes implementation, and the other half is no, it isn't. And it gets derisive, it gets condescending, and it depends, and I think any architect that doesn't give that answer, I'm a little bit dubious about, because the different systems need different types of support. They need different types of ways to grow. And so I don't think that there's a wrong answer to this question. There's a lot of you don't an architect is a bullshit role because the engineers do that. Well, sure, but when you have 30 different pieces of software all interacting with each other, who's thinking about the and aspect of it? And my experience is if it's a completely non-technical process of thinking about it, then you end up, as I've seen, with the product owner who doesn't want to have to deal with the internal team or the problems with the current software system. So they go rogue and they hire somebody from another country and they build another piece of software over here that no one knows how it works, that's delivering, but that's still part of the system. So we end up with this Rube Goldberg machine of a system with no way of really, where are the leverage points? Where can we make a small change in a pattern or a structure that will help unlock some of these challenges the system as a whole are experiencing? So to
So an
answer the
architect
question,
is their job is to avoid the Rube Goldberg gravity.
Well, and I think one of the problems is that architect became a role and something in the org chart and a pay grade, and so that confused the issue a
Hmm.
lot.
yeah, that it's so I have a picture in the book about systems, like what is and also a lot about what systems leadership. What do we mean by this? Which is more about integration and synthesis and knowledge flow, and it is about the technology, but it's in partnership with with everyone, with people in it. So the architect as a promotion from senior engineer is one form of it, but I would argue that it's one form. And when I say systems architect, that's not what I mean. Right? I don't mean Kubernetes certification. And the reason I do, it's which I find endlessly challenging. Even today, this came up, is that as we move from reductionism to the point that you were making earlier about we take complexity and we break it down into parts. That's what object oriented is. That we try and linearize, eventually get to a Gantt chart of processes. But we know now that that doesn't scale, that as complexity increases, it doesn't scale. So what do we do? Like, and that's what we're figuring out. That's what I call systems architecture, and it requires a skill set that we don't tend to value in tech culture. And that's a real challenge where it's the if what we're really doing is just having a my tech knowledge store is bigger than your tech knowledge store argument, then we're probably not actually doing something positive for the system. So I think one of the challenge in the way I define architect is it integrates skills that aren't necessarily whiteboard testable. And that's usually where the conversation can get a little stuck.
So can we back up? You said it
Yeah.
requires a skill set that aren't valued in technology. What can you describe those?
Communication skills, interpersonal skills, critical thinking skills, the ability to synthesize knowledge and information and use sound judgment to prioritize, the ability to be comfortable in uncertainty, to be comfortable with ambiguity, to not need everything to be concrete. This is when people say it's too abstract, Diana, I need you to be concrete. Okay, I can come onto the property and pour a piece of concrete, but that's where the house is going to go. And that's the direction it's going to face. So you probably want me to be careful about concrete. And concrete matters for sure, but my dogs aren't concrete, right? The bathtub isn't concrete. It's part of our skill set. Reductionism, linear thinking are essential to delivering good software. No, it's not one or the other. But also so are empathy, and by this I mean the ability to shift perspective, to see what the code is doing from other people's experiential perspective. And it's also understanding everything that's in production is what we thought about, that we're knowledge workers. And our primary role is to be better at knowledge work, which often requires thinking practices. It's funny how radical it was originally to talk about thinking and awareness of one's thinking, metacognition, the awareness of logical fallacies and cognitive biases as tech skills. There was a lot of pushback on that. And it makes me kind of chuckle because I'm like, but we where you but we are we're using these skills every time that we're making these decisions, and so it's part of the package, I think.
Well, I think it's because we were initially so focused on, I mean, even inventing the computer and getting the wires and it was all so very focused on that. And the programs themselves were not very sophisticated. But as we started developing more sophisticated programs, it's almost like they started to match the sophistication of humans. You know, I I understand why that was, but I also understand, well, this is why we need to move more and more towards, I mean, it's becoming easier to generate code, even good code using AI stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, what is it that we want to do? What problem are we trying to solve? Anyway, I want to know because the title of your book again?
Learning systems thinking.
Okay, so what is systems thinking, according to your
Yeah, well,
definition?
so
Because
one of the
I mean, I know I dabbled in it. I was briefly in a PhD program that was engineering systems, and I thought it was going to be something like that. It was a long time ago. Anyway, so I'm curious how you define it.
Yeah. So the subtitle is something like is so funny that I don't remember because I don't, it's like my own phone number, right? I don't call me. I don't know what at the end of it, but it's nonlinear skills and practices. So the challenge with using the phrase systems thinking is that one, there is not a standard definition. You know, academia, for example, tends to approach it differently than, let's say, business side of in workshops. Also, I also mean pattern thinking, parallel thinking, critical thinking, but nonlinear thinking is also not a great title and not a good book title, and not really what people are looking for now. And so that's where we settled on systems thinking, and also because it is for technology professionals, software system professionals. But the it's really a group of practices, all forms of thinking and systems thinking included, is more rightly described as a group of practices that, when done well, enable people to do hard things together, right? That we we're not good at that, at the doing hard things together, for all the reasons you've already mentioned, right? About the ways that we try to linearize or silo or break down. And so when we enter that realm, accepting that things are always changing, accepting that we can't know the right thing to do as complexity increases, I would argue it was delusional that we did think that we knew exactly what the right thing to do was. But, you know, it's more so now. And so it includes things like cultivating self awareness, which again is sort of a surprise as a technology skill, right? But that it includes learning to respond rather than react. Because what's often happening is we're in these discussions and someone says something, we want to bite them, and then we're like engaged in this reaction as opposed to being able to use systemic reasoning, which is the art and science of developing ideas and recommendations that are supported by sound reasoning. And it's as simple as I can give you my opinion about which JavaScript framework is best or right or whatever. But systemic reasoning is I show you how I arrived at this conclusion. What were the reasons that supported it? Why is it relevant in this particular context? Because there's no one right thing that's right for every circumstance. What about this circumstance?
That sounds a lot harder than
Mhm.
just having an opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And I call it like tech, we are an opinion driven culture. Like that. And I love it. We could spend all this time talking about opinions. I like opinions. Opinions are not helpful when you're trying to reach a conclusion that is the best possible conclusion under your circumstances, even though there's no one right answer. So it's the practice of being able to create conceptual integrity, which Fred Brooks says is the most important consideration in systems design. But basically, it's kind of the Conway thing. What we put in production will reflect the way we think and communicate. So, if we're doing complex things, we need to be able to think and communicate well in the complexity, not by siloing or negating it, and develop that ability so that we can basically be the system we want to develop.
So you said systems thinking is a set of practices. Can you enumerate those?
Well, cultivating self-awareness, that would be one of them. Like, you know, I get up every morning and write for a while of just whatever, give myself a chance to listen to what I think and learning to notice my reactions. Also, how often my reactions don't help anything and aren't really trustworthy or valuable. But then also for me, from an architecture point of view, it's synthesizing knowledge and information, and it's usually not my knowledge, right? It's from across the system, looking at a challenge from multiple points of view and being able to synthesize something that will actually have a positive impact. So in systems, we talk about leverage points, which is about understanding how a system is reinforcing itself and where to intervene in a way that will actually move it in the desirable direction. So this sounds very straightforward, but we know that's actually really hard. And the two things we know, one is that we are almost always blaming. There's a lot of system science that shows, that you put people in a situation in which better thinking and communication could actually have helped, but they were reacting. And then you ask them what happened, and they blame the wrong things. And also counterintuitiveness. Because the way that we perceive the world arises from our own beliefs and values and mental models, but also the structures and patterns that have acted on us. Like, for example, we all went to school, and that taught us things about thinking and what's true that then we bring into circumstances. Counterintuitiveness is, so Jay Forrester says he went into organization after organization and discovered that for the most part, people did know where a leverage point was. Like, they did know where things were getting tangled, where the blockage was, but they're pushing it in the wrong direction. And this is very, very common. We're almost always blaming the wrong thing, and we're almost always doing the wrong thing. And that's not a bad thing or a judgment. That's part of the process. The first time we moved from monolithic software to microservices, we're like, wow, these are really tightly coupled. I wonder how that happened. But we didn't understand the mind shift involved until we practiced for a while, and then we got it.
So would you say that we operate in a implicit system that we maybe aren't aware of, that's been shaped by culture and environment and learning and all those things you mentioned, and that implicit system that we're operating in may not be the best one. And so part of your goal with the book was to help you think about systems and how they can be better, rather than just use the default system that.
Right. And also, I'm going to observe that you're asking, I mean, a lot of people are attracted to this field because it seems deterministic and controllable. And it feels like, oh, we don't have to deal with these, weird human uncertainty aspects. And you're saying, oh, we're going to have to push you into experiencing them. Everybody needs to learn nonviolent communication, and all these different things. And it's like, God, it sounds like quite an uphill battle.
So to the first one, which I liked better,
Of course you do.
to the first one, if I could have written that on the back of my book, if I could still make changes, that's actually what I would write. And I would even expand it to say, it doesn't work. Like, I've been doing this with organizations sincerely trying to change as the paradigm has shifted around them. They're trying to move their software systems to maintain competitive advantage and use modern tools. So they'll modernize without realizing modernization is a mental paradigm shift and an organizational paradigm shift and a structural shift. And there's a very snarky organization that someone put up a website. I can't even remember what it is. It's SADMF, like Scaled Agile DevOps. Like, it's all made up. But the tagline is enterprise transformation without the risk of culture change. And I love that.
Yes.
right? So we're
Oh,
taking nonlinear change, the desire for nonlinear change, and we're trying to stick it into a hierarchical, dualistic, concerned with control, procedural environment, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
and
So
maybe I think this is an important piece. Like, it did kind of work for a little while. And I think that what happened, and maybe at different points for different industries, but the complexity of the systems that we were being required to build reached the point where our ways of thinking no longer worked to be able to deliver on that complexity, the complexity requirements. And so I think maybe what your book is about is we need to have new systems and new ways to think about things so that we can tackle the monumental complexity that now exists in any modern system.
And ultimately, how are you going to deal with the issue that hierarchy is about maintaining control and producing the same thing over and over again? And we're moving, I mean, especially in software, we're moving into this world where it's all about creativity, and those two just don't mesh. The hierarchy is always going to fight the creativity. So
the system always pushes back. This is part of changing a system. You 2 steps forward and 40 steps back, and back to our original conversation, do things change what we do? So I use the iceberg model, which is a really common thing in systems thinking. But what it really shows us is that we're responding to visible events on the surface, but underneath are patterns and structures and core mental models that are generating the system we work in. And if we respond to visual events, but we don't change our core mental models, we're going to end up having a modern system with modern tools that has many of the same challenges.
well, and I
And
think the hierarchy is then going to push back and try and I mean, I think maybe that's what happened with Agile, is it's like, yeah, we move forward, we have better communication, and then the hierarchy goes, yeah, but I really want to have control. So it kind of eventually happened that it failed. Yeah.
You can build a house for a little while on top of the iceberg, but at some point, if you haven't actually changed what's underneath, it's gonna tip over or something,
Mm.
right?
right. And to this, this is an excellent point that you're raising, and I'm definitely not avoiding it. It is that so many organizations value knowledge stock. How much do you know? So if I get a whiteboard test, for example, you're testing me on how much knowledge stock I have. But increasingly, organizations succeed or fail based on knowledge flow. How am I able to generate new knowledge? Am I able to shape information in emerging contexts? How am I doing this? And so, experientially, as soon as the system pushes back and tries to regain control, it gets worse. So, what I've been seeing is that's what happens. It hits the iceberg. Then they suffer the repercussions of that. And at some point, then kind of keep trying again. They sort of keep trying again to solve this problem that you're talking about. And I think it's an iterative process because hierarchical control, what we mean by management, this came to us in the US. This is hundreds of years old. And school mirrors this structure of, right? Peter Senji says that we'll never change our system of management till we change our system of education because they're the same system. So we are, to your point, that is the heavy monolithic gravity, and can we? And I got tired of shouting at the tidal wave of this situation because it's so difficult and it just comes back again, and started focusing on what's the experiences we can give people so they get a taste of how much more influence you have if you give up over control. Like if you give up procedural, like you need it where you need it, But what about the and parts? Like where is it actually limiting you? What is leadership from a systems point of view? How do you enable knowledge flow? How do you lead in a way that creates where the system, the relationships between the people and the technology are greater than the sum of their parts? And we're really relatively new,
I
except
think
we're not.
what you just said about creating experiences. I mean, this is what we've seen when we hold open spaces conferences, because there will always be, if you know, some new people who come and they go, "Wow, this can't possibly work," and then they have, and they're totally convinced, and you couldn't talk them into it, but then they have the experience, and all of a sudden they're converts.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what kind of experiences? I mean, I agree with you, that huge tidal wave, and you look at it and you go, okay, we somehow have to evolve away from this hierarchical command and control system if we're going to move forward. I don't know how to do that. I'm sort of like, maybe it just
It's
has
really
to
hard to
happen.
give everyone the experience that
Well, it's hard to
could.
give it, and plus there's an intrinsic, when you get up into the hierarchy, you get benefits from that, and you don't want to give those up. You know, I like being able to tell everybody what to do, and deciding that I should get most of the money and all of those things. You know, it's like I don't want to give that up.
Yeah, the system definitely reinforces
Oh
itself.
yeah.
It does. And I had an advantage because I I mean, when I was a girl, there were no personal computers or the unlike Jimmy Buffett's A Pirate Looks at 40, right? The occupational hazard being the occupation's just not around. Like I had to wait for the world to invent my career for me so then I could go and have it. And one of those things is I had been parenting. My son is a microservices architect, so like I had lots of training before I went into engineering and engineering leadership. And I'm not interested in parenting engineers, nor do I think they really need me to do that. So there was a lot about management that felt like a nanny culture. And I'm just like, yeah, I mean, I know that I want to do hard things with other people. And now I see that was a huge advantage because, sure, it's very glittery. It's lovely to have a great title. It's lovely to have some control. Even in a meeting today, I really had to think through, I really want to get some control over this situation. But do I? Is that like really pay attention to it? But the if we think about how to nourish and cultivate knowledge work, if we think of software as knowledge and how to cultivate knowledge work, then the command and control it is a limitation. And if you're okay with the limitation, sure, but if you want innovation, if you want emergence, and I wanted to say too, the two quick things. One is that I hear this a lot and it's very fair. Someone in an interview asked me, they're like, I have to think about 7 different languages and 4 different, and never mind terraforming. And now you want me to think about everything. Is that what you're saying? Now you want me to think about everything? No, in the sense that this is why we form a system of people thinking together. I do systems thinking full time, but you don't need a whole bunch of people doing that. Like that, the um, the partner together to share knowledge and information so that we can create what we're trying to create lying on these interpersonal relationships. And so we're not making a hero who knows everything now. We're
Yeah,
trying
but
to.
don't you think that the team at least needs to understand some things about system thinking in order to consume what you're...
It seems like there's this element that is just bringing awareness to the implicit things. We should be aware that if we're in a hierarchy, that has an impact in how we're how we're building software or delivering on the system or whatever, and at least be able to recognize that that is a piece of the system. The hierarchy that we're in is a piece of the system, and it has impacts. Likewise, communication structures and process structures and decision making flow, like at least begin to recognize all these things that we just this is water, recognize how it actually is impacting how we're able to build and deliver our software.
Yeah, and so I have a bias here, so that I think is important to call out, and that I have worked mostly on what we now call, like, what we used to call agile, till we decided that agile is responsible for climate change, and now we are supposed to hate on it. But I'm like, well, I mean, agile was invented because reality refuses to bow down to power. Has that been fixed? Because I don't think that's fixed. And I'm not saying we should stick with something that isn't working for us, but also, like, I think power is the challenge. Anyway, point is, I've always worked on self-organizing teams in doing stuff that we don't know how to do. That's usually why they hired us. And that I usually work on some type of transformation or greenfield work. And I've come to have this is a complete opinion, so not systemic reasoning. But like, anyone who wants to do systems kind of work needs to work in professional services or something like that for at least a little bit of time, where you have to communicate what it is you're going to build and why you're going to build it. And then you have to partner with other people to be effective together to deliver it. Like, we had to think well together. We had to operate with interpersonal trust and these kinds of things in order to do what we were doing. And I didn't know that I was lucky to be having those experiences, because I didn't know that they weren't usual until much later. So I would argue, if an organization or a team does not have any systems thinking, systemic reasoning, ability to deal with uncertainty, if they're in a hierarchy that is about delivering procedural control, then systems thinking is not going to help you. Because as soon as you're in a discussion, when you're talking about a system, if the three of us are talking about it, and one of you says, I don't care what you say, I'm the CTO, this is what I want, we're not doing systems thinking, we're doing politics. And that's okay, that's part of the system. But systems thinking includes consent. It includes the agreement to help other people also strengthen their reasons and think through things. Like, at the core of the practice is the practice. So you can't bring a horse to water, and you cannot make them drink. At least I've not found out where. So I tend to focus in places, even in organizations. Lots of organizations that have this structure will have places where they're really trying to shift a leverage point, and you actually can get pretty far in that particular bubble. I call it a greenhouse in an organization. But it's been my experience, what you're saying too, is we're so used to these power structures that they will try and reinstate themselves. And then that brings up the question of, can I help? How can I
Right.
help?
If
Yeah.
you can, yeah, I find myself thinking, oh yeah, it's really what I didn't do in any of my experiences was like to go, I see this is what's going on here. And once you recognize, you can go, I can, either figure out how to work within it or say that's not in my
Not for me,
bailiwick.
yeah.
Whereas I think I would just struggle against it. Oh, yeah, this is wrong. It should be this way. Never worked.
But there must be a part of systems thinking that would allow you, after the awareness of the system that you're in and the different pieces to it and how it works, to then know that maybe you can't change the environment that you're in, but there maybe there's like a microservice model that you can have where within your small piece of the system you can at least make some improvements.
Right, knowing what, yeah, that's, to me, that's what a consultant is able to do, rather than the carpet bombing approach of saying, okay, you're doing it wrong, here's the right way to do it, and nobody changes. To come in and say, okay, you might want big changes, but here's what you're capable of. And so we're going to focus on that. Here's what's possible, given that, be able to see the environment, so you can say, oh yeah, you can actually, you're not using automated builds or something. All right, that's where we need to focus, because you're not ready to change all these other things.
Yeah, it's been, I mean, in that's exactly, even as staff, as a principal systems architect, I've been able to do that, like find the place where it's in production. Now maybe it's on the side and everyone hates it, like nobody got on board. They still don't think that she doesn't know what she's talking about. But the experience speaks for itself, right? And there's pretty much always been a way to do that. Also, it's the experience that people have that's so valuable. There's so many people that haven't ever really had a joyful experience doing what we do, that they've gotten caught up in the spider web of this. One of the things that's been incredibly rewarding in my career is the people who have had that as part of what we're doing. And so they go out and they know the difference now. Like they know, they don't think this is just the way it is. They know it can be different. And so over time, we're all kind of trying to figure out how to plant seeds, what words to use. We don't have a good vocabulary, even Agile. When I ask people, okay, will you tell me about the zombie apocalypse that clearly you're describing? They describe horrible situations. I totally agree. I would hate being in that situation. It also isn't anything that I would call agility. So we don't have a vocabulary for talking about these experiences because they're so unfamiliar, and we have a word that everyone kind of knows what that word means, but in fact experientially we have such different experiences often that we don't mean the same thing, and architect is one of those words.
I think I know the intent of Agile was, through better communication, through adjusting and creating these practices, was to create that great experience for everybody, including the stakeholders. It just was a first iteration.
Well, and it wasn't systems thinking based, where it didn't, and that was maybe part of the problem.
Still trying to work within the domination hierarchy.
Or I think not even recognizing
that it was there. Yeah, it was just saying, okay, what can we do as programmers to work better with the stakeholders and have nicer processes, but not looking at the big picture. It was like, but ultimately the domination hierarchy is gonna dominate. That's what they do. So not big enough thinking.
Yeah, and if you're doing feature-driven development, then it's a process that you can do it cross-functionally, you can be flexible. And the other thing is, it's not meant to be taken literally. We have such a religious view of so many of these things where it's like, this is the Bible and this is what we have to do, as opposed to we're knowledge workers. We take these experiences and we evolve them as we learn, as we mature, as we grow. And we get to do that. We made it up. We made up Agile, we made up Kafka, we made up hierarchies, we made up all of these things. So we can make up other things as we go along. But instead we have a very dualistic, something's good or it's bad, it's right or it's wrong, it's yes or it's no. And there's very rarely a dualistic answer to most questions. One thing I did want to interject in case I wasn't clear about it. I do think that complexity, generally speaking, is a huge challenge. 20 years ago, the software we were building was pretty complex. Like there was a fair amount of interrelated code. I think what's pushed us most in this direction is relational complexity, meaning that
The
software
teams have gotten much larger.
teams
The
have got, well, that part, but more from the tech, like, well, the socio-technical aspect, right? That so when I was a girl, if I wanted to go to the movies, I went out at 8 o'clock on Saturday night. And if I wanted to send a letter, I mailed the letter. And if I needed a book, I went to the bookstore or to the library. And we have software systems that have replaced all of that human capacity, all that human capability. We walk around with software, running software in our pockets. We ask Alexa in the kitchen while cooking dinner about peanut allergies. Software now isn't a thing you build and then you go over and use as often anymore as it's just part of a giant ecosystem sharing knowledge and information.
Mm.
And that's the complexity that I think systems thinking is trying to address, is that if we could go back to the world in which I had one code base, I would make my branch and I would merge it to trunk and the tests would run. And if I'm doing that, I need less of systems thinking practices than I do now, where the systems that I work on have, many different services and information flow and context matters, and this information could be consumed by nearly infinite products, platforms, people, contexts over time. For me, that's the software transformation more than the complexity inside an individual piece of software, although I do think that's increased as well.
And I think we maybe thought for a while that the right process, the right architecture, the right abstraction could like solve those things. Like that was our like golden ticket out of the inability to keep up with the complexity in the ecosystem. And I think part of what you're proposing is saying those things alone aren't enough. Maybe they're part of it, but we actually need to step even further back and be like, what is the system of thinking that is all the pieces to how the stuff happens, and how do we have a better system of thinking about all the things rather than just the abstractions, architecture, and process. Is that
Yeah, I mean, the complexity that we're facing, the changes, the paradigm shifts that we're facing, all the JavaScript in the world is not going to fix it. Like that, and it matters, like not in any way to diminish technology skills and the good implementation of software absolutely matters, and the tools. There was a LinkedIn, I'll go with kerfluffle. You used a word earlier that I really liked too, and now I can't remember what it was, and I wanted to
kerfuffle's
make
a
a
good
note of
word.
it. But I used kerfluffle, and I made a snarky comment about, what conversation about transformation and agility, not agile, but as much agility and changing the kinds of structures we're talking about. And it had gotten into the realm of gender, and like, well, I mean, really, what would it, I raised female, and people, what would I know about communication and interpersonal skills, that I just want to go to Kubernetes conferences and solve socio-technical problems with JavaScript. Like this is my life, right? And she'll mean this in a snarky way, like, I kind of wish. I wish when there's a bug in production, if the bug is in the code, in a line of code, that's a good day. Like, that's great, right? Because it's usually harder to figure out why these relationships aren't relating the way that we meant them to. And I think one of the real hard things too is that we've grown up with information shaped for us in the shape of a book or an album or CD or, collection, or an email. And then we have, or a blog, a web page, and we have software that makes these shapes. So the software makes a shape, and then you go in and you put information in the shape. But what is the shape of information in a world in which all digital software potentially can interact with all other digital software, where you can be looking at a piece of information that's come from 17 different sources and then blended together in 3 different front ends, depending on where you are or the context that you're in? What do we even call those shapes? And how do we design software for informational emergence rather than building a space to put the show images, right?
Huh.
Do you think that, I mean, a lot of this, I feel like, okay, it's kind of the cost of experimentation. We look at building larger and more complex systems. They're much more expensive. If they fail, it's really expensive. And it seems to me that we're starting to see, at least in some areas of science, machine learning systems are able to winnow through a lot of these experiments and more rapidly narrow down to a set that or maybe is more likely to work. Do you think that machine learning systems might have some benefits in this arena?
It depends, is my cautious answer. So, one of the challenges is these systems represent our mental models, structures, and patterns. So, to some extent, they're our factory. We've encoded our factory, and then we hope they're going to give us something not a factory. So, that's my caution.
Sure.
Simultaneously, we are cultivating relationships between information, right? That's the other and, right? Is what are the patterns in this ubiquitous information that means something, right? How do you create a collection of information that's very useful from like these sources? This is something that the software does way faster than we do. It's a challenge because they'll only look for patterns we know to ask them to. So, can machines do systems thinking? No, I don't think machines can do writing either. They can write words, but I wouldn't replace the human process of cultivating ideas and language with a machine. But if we keep right relationship with it, and if we understand its limitations, then to me, it's like a vacuum cleaner. Sure, I can get down on my hands and knees and sweep the floor with my toothbrush, but why would I do that when I could use a vacuum cleaner? Like, I think if we use tools to serve our missions and we're careful about the impact of those tools, then I don't think it's the software. Like, people talk about social media platforms as responsible for these negative outcomes that they can have. But if we think about what Facebook was when it was invented, it was invented basically hazing women on a college campus, right? So what do you think it's going to scale to be? Do you know what I mean? Like these core, our core way of viewing the world is going to be expressed through our software, and then we get mad because it expresses that view. We need to change that view and so what would be software that really does create connection? What would that look like? That's hard.
Yeah,
That's a
I
hard
think
question.
ultimately end up, I mean, I see this over and over again since I started noticing. It's like, oh, we go, if scientists hadn't invented this, then this bad thing wouldn't have happened. And you go, no, it's the people who wanted to make the, weapon or whatever it is, and who wanted to use the weapon. And we go, no, it's the science, it's the technology. and I think what to your point about I mean, you said, okay, machine learning systems are an image of all of the data that it's collected off of the internet. That's the way it is now, but I think it's going to move to being a science machine where it's able to say, here's something I don't know, and somehow say, here's an experiment we can do, or a set of experiments to increase the knowledge, rather than just go, well, what are the opinions of every rando on the internet? And I'll just make up something from that. And then we'll have something that will allow us to really move forward.
That's systems. That's what I would call systems architecture. What you just described, which is
Mm,
framing the questions to see in the blind spots, and not to get a necessarily expecting a quick, concrete answer. But if you shift perspective, can you see the blocker that you couldn't see before? And so it would be lovely if that's what happens. I don't have as much faith as it seems that you might, but that I'm kind of a. It's interesting to be in this profession, and I'm kind of a Luddite simultaneously.
I'll believe it when I see it.
yeah, one of the best definitions that I've heard of science is that it's what works, and that's why I believe we will move in that direction, is because the people who create the science-based machine learning systems are going to have much better results. So that's that's why it will move forward.
But I get the backwards. I did this. The kind of it was interesting. It's not controversial at all in some areas, and in others, people have said that it's political, which is kind of strange to me. And this is what it is. So using the iceberg model in workshops to help people have an experience of thinking about what are some of the patterns and structures that are reinforcing. So there's a bug in production. Bug in production can mean a whole bunch of things. Sometimes it means we tried something and it didn't work. So there's no action. I don't need any command and control. We tried it and it didn't work. But other times it's happening because there's too much command and control, or because the processes are bad, or because the system is very frail, but the engineers are getting blamed for the bugs when in fact it's a systemic issue. The more the engineers get blamed and controlled, the less time they have to reduce the frailty in the system. So it
The shit's good.
causes its own. But
I like that
we
word, frailty.
frailty,
Mm.
and it's a relational frailty too, right? But so we one of the biggest things is that shifting paradigms, meaning the rules and structures and mental models out of which a system arises, is the biggest transformational impact we could have on a system. We're not doing that all the time, not even most of the time. But when we can do it, that's really where our power lies. And that it's very terrifying for people in organizations to consider changing the rules and the structures and what they're used to. So part of the process is sort of helping that. So I've used the example, and Matt Wynn, who I totally adore, highly recommend to have a conversation with him if you haven't yet. I think one of the original founders of Cucumber, or this, like, been in open source. Lots of good thinking on pairing. Anyway, we did a workshop at Domain Driven Design Europe this year where I had 50 people using the iceberg model and said, okay, so on the surface, 91.88%, according to a study in 2022, of software developers worldwide are male. So, if you were going to do that on purpose, if that was your goal, I would like a system that generates 92% male in this role. What are the patterns and structures that you would put in place? And also, why are you doing that? What is your core mental model? Because what we often do is when you have an outcome like 91.88%, we say, well, that's because men are naturally able to do this, or naturally more inclined. But is there science to back that up? And often science is saying something else, right? Like, and but we want to justify an outcome with a belief. That's just part of human nature. So shifting people into a place and say, okay, so what if you wanted to do that? How would you do it? Then if you look at some of these patterns and structures, what if your goal was diversity and you can define that any way you want? Like, it doesn't have to even be gender or whatever. Just systems tend to thrive in diversity. A monocrop is very rarely a healthy system. A healthy system thrives in diversity. So if you wanted to do it, and then look for the leverage points, the little things we might do, because remembering we're blaming the wrong thing, we're doing the wrong thing, we invented this system and we think it's happening to us, not that we are the architects. And then how do we engage? And what's wonderful about it is it's very hard. Like I've been in tech 20 years. I don't know the answer to this question. I mean, I have ideas, and all systems challenges are like that. We see the outcome, we think it's justified by a belief that comes out was either what generated it in the first place or is keeping it in place. And when you look at then shifting, it's very, very, very hard to do. So
Let me tell you an experience that I had. This is way back in the, I don't know, late 80s or early 90s. We did this Borland OOP World Tour. We all over the world speaking about object-oriented programming. I mean, I'm a little embarrassed because I thought I knew what I was talking about then, of course. Anyway, all these different countries. And of course, you're right. Every place was hardly any women. Many audiences, no women at all. And then we get to Japan. Now, think what you might about Japan, but we go there and it's like the audience, one of our bigger ones, 300, 500, something like that, 80% women. I'm going, whoa, what? I mean, these Japanese, they're so forward thinking that they have all these women in programming. And then eventually understood that, well, what had happened was that it was, well, programming. I mean, what do you do when you program? You type. Typing is women's work, was then. So men weren't gonna do that, and so we ended up with all these women, and it was just like such an inverted view. And then when I realized, I go, no, it's worse than I thought. It was like initially it was like they launched all these women into this field,
Even deeper into the patriarchy.
Oh, even deeper, and then eventually, of course, men in Japan figured out that, oh no, this is the status job, so we don't want women in it, we want to take over. So that was eye opener for me.
Yeah,
that's a fascinating exercise, because I think what it helps me to see is that we all operate within systems. Some of us are aware of the systems that we operate in, and some of us do things to change the systems. And I think that your book is, if you want to become aware and change the system, you have to start doing systems thinking.
Right.
Is that the right system?
Yeah, and to some extent, I'm saying it because what choice do we have? I mean, if you can find a way to not be part of a system or have to think about that at work or whatever, that's not a bad thing necessarily. But for me, if I want to be effective, if I want to have a positive impact and I want to do hard things together, then the status quo just isn't, it's not gonna, I'm just getting on the same bus that never takes me where I'm going, and then I'm mad at the bus, like, and so what's the alternative? And it's trying to, like, I love this conversation, one, because other people have loved talking to you, so I'm always like, I want to go talk, I want to talk to them. But also that there is no magic bullet and there is no prophet or messiah. There is no one right way. The only way we're going to figure this out is to think about it together, to try experiments, to have some trust in other people's ability to engage with some of this stuff. I want it to be more, I always want to be kinder and more empathetic and sensitive or whatever. That it's that's a part of what motivates me, but what mostly motivates me is I love doing complex things with other people, and I like to have a positive impact. And
I was going to ask why you wrote the book, and is that the same answer? Is that
yeah, I
why?
didn't want to scream at the tidal wave anymore. And I'd had enough experiences as a systems architect to be like, I'm going down with the next damn ship. I can't keep doing this. Like, I cannot. And then, I come out of open source originally. So the answer comes to my mind is like, okay, well, what are you contributing towards a change? And then I discovered that's way harder. That's so much harder. My God, that's hard. But I was a writer before I went into tech, and I actually quit writing to seriously focus on. I moved to Austin. I'd never been to Austin, Texas, but that's where all the good tech was happening. And I love my career, but it is ironic that it came full
Loop
circle
back around to being a writer again.
Yeah, I had the
because the
same
thing is,
experience.
did you like it's? I
Yeah.
mean, it's
Well, journalism major for my first year in college, and then I changed to physics, and then engineering and everything, and then but I never stopped writing and started writing for magazines, etc. But it felt like it almost felt like destiny or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, I started here, and then you ended up doing this.
because
So.
they aren't I mean, it's language. It's all the
Mhm.
construction of logic using language. There's no the fact that I bought into this soft skills, hard skills, or these like the fact that I really believed in these silos is sad to me now. Like the in the sense that they're different and they're differently applied. I like coding because when something doesn't work, it doesn't work. In a paragraph, you don't get that good. You can't just run it and see if it works.
Can't write the unit test for your prose.
But I will say though, towards the end of the book I had a couple of great reviewers that really helped me to strengthen it. And what I did was took each section and put it through AI to have it summarize me. And if the
Mm.
summary is what I meant to say, then it was probably solid, and usually it was. But if the summary wandered off and started talking about something I wasn't, didn't make the point, then I would go back in and look.
Oh,
So I did
that
have
is a
unit
That's a
fun
tests.
good.
unit.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
well. There's that, and then there's also using it in a seminar. That's what I did
Mm.
with both
That's
thinking
the
in C++
integration
and
test.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I suppose that would be.
Yeah.
But using, I mean, reading it aloud to yourself, but actually aloud is super helpful. But I hadn't thought of taking your paragraph, putting it through the AI, and saying, "Is that what I meant to say? Better rewrite it." I like that. That
Yeah.
is a unit test. Yeah.
And I made it a
That's a better
knowledge
system.
graph.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made it a knowledge graph so that the first time I use a concept, I link to that and the definition so that I could see when did I introduce a concept. And what I discovered about myself, it was it was a terrible week. It was such a hard week. I I I'm struggling to clarify. I go into the kitchen and Don, my husband, I said, I everyone says that sometimes I use like a concept to describe a concept. And so they're not really understanding because if you didn't understand the second concept, you went to first. And he said, honey, did you use a concept in a concept to describe yet a third concept? I'm like, shut up. Four times I did this one thing. And so this having to part of writing this book that I hate, and I can say it now because I didn't know I signed up for it. This book changed me because I was on to myself the whole time. Bugs in my thinking became even more clear, my own cognitive biases, my own ways of not like so the this is when we're thinking, we're really running the software that's in our brain and testing that software. And now it doesn't seem like a thing. I give workshops and talks and things, and it's fine. But when I first started, people are like, why would you write a book about thinking? Because that's what we do. Like, like, isn't that what we do? Like, isn't that what's in production? Our thinking and then our use of language and construct and our relationships to each other and to perspectives and our beliefs.
What's really hard about what you tackled was that it's probably very easy after reading the book to use the content of the book to criticize the book. And so you have, I'm sure, had to make sure that your book actually like lives the tenets and principles that the book
Internal
yeah,
consistency.
yeah, exactly. The internal consistency of your book has to be high.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
'cause you're
that's
trying.
why. Yeah, that's what part of the reason I wrote it is I didn't know if I could, but I also felt like I had the right combination of experiences to try, and we need people to try. So I'm gonna try, right? Like I think if I hadn't had writing practice, it's too big an idea. Um, but also, I mean, I'm a female in tech for 20 years. So there's never a time in which people don't tell me I'm wrong about what I'm saying. That is a given. That will happen. And my editor said, are you going to be okay? I'm like, no, I'm not. It hurts. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. I've had people explain to me why my talk was completely erroneous, even though in the talk I quoted people with not just me, with so
You
I
quoted men?
I quoted lots of
Whoa.
men
Well,
in the
I
room,
how
right? But they know. So this, like,
But they know.
I've already had, this is why when you ask the architect question, I'm like, I get this. Like that, I was with a group, principal systems architect with a group of very senior engineers. How do we develop an architecture practice? I said, let's start with just heuristics. Like, what are the fundamental things we care about so that keeps us, you know, we have an agreed upon these are the things that really matter to us and we take the step. So I did some drafts and then said, here's some ideas we can do. And any questions? Yes, this is an architecture. So let's begin with what a question is. A question has a question mark at the end of the sentence, but also this, if I am not saying what the system pushes back on me, right? I'm not saying what everybody knows is the right thing to say in tech, and therefore we will explain to her why, as opposed to understand why I might come from a different perspective. Doesn't mean I'm right, but maybe there's something valuable in what I'm saying. I will say, though, that the amount of nourishment and support and inspiration that I experience now is truly outstanding to me sometimes. And I'm understanding things that where sexism is just being an asshole. Like the person's like that to everybody. Yeah, I get it worse because the person can, sees me as lower rank, but that doesn't mean that that's the only person that. So, not to suggest that patriarchy isn't, patriarchy is the number one blocker to systems thinking because patriarchy is a system that wants to remain a system. This is where command and control. This doesn't mean men, though. Men are in the system, women are in the system, and that my colleagues, my male colleagues, suffer from the same type of rigid thinking challenges and being sidelined when they don't say the right thing or if they're being less concrete. So I feel like we're starting to move in a direction where we don't have to be trapped in a binary anymore. We can actually have some nuance in the conversations. The fact that O'Reilly asked me about writing this book and then have been great doing it. I've said this to them too. 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure that would not have happened. Like, this is not tech. One publisher said, "This is like a self-help book."
Yes and
Well,
no.
I mean, there are, you are asking people to look at things within themselves.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds
Yeah.
like you're proposing some firmware updates to our brains, and
Mm-hmm.
there's
Those are harder to do.
those are
I
harder
mean,
to do. Yeah, and it requires some.
you have to want to.
You have to want
You
to.
have to want to. You have to want
Yeah.
to. And also, honestly, I just don't want us to feel so alone all the time. Like, you do this and you really can feel like it's like a giant form of gaslighting. The emperor has no clothes and you're like, "Hey." So as long as we're isolated from each other in that system, we're not going to have an impact. And I just want people to understand they're not crazy. The system is reinforcing things that aren't workable and aren't sensical, and that there are things that we can do to have a positive impact, not on every situation. Sometimes you have to go, like, again, you have to know when to go. In an interview very early on with the Twitter thing, I got asked this right at the beginning. What do I think about what's going on at Twitter? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna like. That is
No
so
comment.
divisive, and it's even more divisive now. But what I said, and I still mean this, is that what it's a great example of for those of us relatively new in this industry, right, is that we're seeing a lot of the patterns we've been through. And we know this isn't a great way to build complex software systems. We know these approaches. I think of Bad Blood, the book about Theranos that wasn't about tech, it was about medical equipment. And so much of that book is familiar to me. I like, this is the way we think we should also build software at an extreme. And so I feel like these experiences that we're having, which unfortunately go with the layoffs, which means it's really actually costing people way more than it's rational or reasonable to have a silver lining. Like, there's no silver lining, this just sucks. And simultaneously, we we are navigating our own careers. One of my big moments of like, why am I not an accountant? What am I doing here? This is ridiculous, is the Sisyphus aspect. How often, if you play glue roles, if you're good at synthesizing, if you do things that I would call systems architecture, then you're just rolling the same rock up the hill and it falls back down again. And you roll it up because someone asked me about cat herding. And I said, you know what? I realized this in the moment. Nobody gets to be a cat. To your point about teams need these skills, right? Nobody
Yeah.
gets to be a cat. I'm not here to cat herd. If you want to be a cat, you need a cat herder. But if we want to do hard things together, so when you were saying about if teams can't do this, they can't do this. This is what I mean. Like, if you need a cat herder, that wouldn't be me, because that had just burned me. That burned me
Oh
out.
yeah. Well, it exhausts you. Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple of things. One was, I don't know where I heard this, but somebody posited, they go, "What if Sisyphus actually enjoyed pushing the rock up the hill every day?" Maybe this. But the other thing was what Trond said last week, which kind of I'm still working on, because I said, well, okay, you want to create self-organizing systems. What's the formula? And he goes, the formula is that you put the group that's going to be in this self-organizing system in a workshop, I mean, with themselves, and they figure out the organization. And I was like, that does sound right, but it also sounds, I wanted a formula.
Yeah. You wanted to control.
I wanted to say, well, how do you control this so that you generate a self-organizing system? And he goes, well, you don't. I was like,
Right? I do this.
We
I
still got
run
some
into
things
it
to work
all the
on.
time. It's sad. It's like I'm like, oh my God, I do it. I do.
mm-hmm.
I mean, I have the same mental models. And though I do think that we do know that that doesn't always work without some skill development, right? So what's the skill development that those people need to do that well, right? Like, how can we support that work as opposed to we'll let it magically happen? Is there anything we can do that actually nourishes that ecosystem or helps people to do the process of, of servant, what we call servant leadership, which is a very tricky word, but this idea that we're facilitating, I like this a lot, that we're facilitating these processes and coaching them in a way to help them to be stronger and more impactful. And what does that mean?
Do you find it's hard once you become aware of systems thinking? Do you find it hard to not look at so many systems and judge them as being just utterly broken and that no one cares about fixing them? Like that would be hard for me. Like I'd just become really critical of every system.
I think it's a phase you have to go through.
Yeah.
I think before you go, oh yeah, this is to be able to accept it. Initially, you see it, then you get really mad about it, and then it's like what the supposed phases of grief. Yeah, right. And it's like,
so I'm still
okay.
at the early phases of grief with Twitter. The Twitter thing is what made me think about this, because it's really easy for me to externally just be really critical of whatever system is happening there.
That's exact. I mean, that's the straight on question, is that I, for a while, didn't know, as I'm seeing more and more of it. Like, we use the word patriarchy, which is a tricky word because, like Agile, people describe it differently, but just meaning the system that reinforces a particular way of operating. The deeper I got into this, the older I got, the more I'm like, everything's broken. Like, I think the way we educate is broken. I think that, and then for me, so when I was a young girl, I learned to hide that I was good in math and science. Like, that was not good for me. I was, not worth investing in from an educational point of view, but my brother was, because my brother would have to support a family or whatever. Like, what was still happening to not non-straight people in the world, what was still happening to women, what were reproductive rights and control over them. Like, I was born into a world where being female was a tremendous straitjacket in so many ways for somebody like me. And then, decades of work, both inner work for myself, right, moving through the trauma, and the external work here in the US that we saw happen. And then time folded in on itself. And we're like right back in the 1960s in terms of, so much that's happening around me feels so familiar, like the re-rising of these I thought matured. And so I see this similarly in tech, right, where we make progress, but then somebody can come in and command and control. And for me, it's never been I'm not so worried about the commander. I kind of get why somebody would want that. Like, and if we say narcissism or whatever, that helps to explain it. But just like, you get to be king of the world, you want to be king of the world. It's not great, but I mean, I don't agree with it, but I sort of understand it. I struggle with all of the people that enable it. That's all. Like, when I look at, World War II, I look at civil rights in the American South. It's the people in the street screaming at the little kids going to the school because we didn't want dark skinned kids in the school. We only wanted light skinned. And how do you even measure? That's not even a binary. Like, there's all in between. That's always been the thing. And so for me now, that's still a challenge. Like, we have the people that are aggressively trying to have power and dominate, and we have people that are activist. But more than that, we have people that are okay or enabling these patterns that cause so much harm. And that's the thing I hope before I die to figure out how to positively impact?
Well, I think they don't want to lose what they have. I mean, if you reverse the situation and instead of going, oh, what are all the problems with this system? Turn it around and go, well, what are the benefits to the people inside the system? Why would they resist change? Because they go, what we have is, I like where I am right now, or it's tolerable. And then, so if somebody comes along and wants to change something, they go, why? I don't know, that might. And then, of course, you can always fearmonger and make it a scary thing to think about the change. Oh, you might lose. It's loss aversion.
So
That's it.
is part of systems thinking to identify the reasons why the system got to where it was and
And
who
how
it
it's what
benefited
keeps
and
it stable. Yeah,
yeah.
like Gerald Weinberg said, which confused the heck out of me at first. He goes, things are the way they are because they got that way one logical step at a time.
Mhm.
And then it's like, yeah, you can see, oh, yeah, every little decision. And then you're in a place, we don't really like where we are right now. But if you go back, you can go, oh, I can see all the decisions that got us here.
Yeah. Yeah, and that it is, somewhat somewhat historical, but mostly only to understand, are there any outmoded, values, beliefs, mental models that are generating the rules of this system that we maybe already know? We're not really in agreement with, but we haven't dismantled the way that they operate, so they still continue to operate, which is somewhat about history, but that's always tricky. The U.S. is a very young country, so we talk about. And I grew up in Boston, where we thought all history, like straight from ancient Greece to Boston, that's all the history like we learned. That's full on history. And I moved out west to Montana, and I'm like, they have history here. That's weird. I thought all the history was in the original 13 colonies. Then the first time I went to the team that I was working with in London, I'll never live this down. I'm like, this is amazing. Is like, is London looks a lot like Boston. And they're like,
I go, yeah, yeah, yeah,
no.
because we built it
That's odd.
based on Boston.
Yeah, yeah, right.
We
So
modeled it on
how far
Boston.
back do we go, right? Like this is the
Mhm.
argument of, is a patriarchal system the norm? Because if we go back in history, that's how it's been. But how far, I mean, is it? How far back do we go? And also, even if it was historically true, does that mean it's inevitable for the next 2000 years? Do we want to change our mental model? So I think history can be really important, but it also can be, you can't know. The information that comes to us from history will disclude the people who didn't have any impact, but were in fact acting in the system. And so it can be kind of, even in a legacy code base, I know for myself, I'm like, I don't know why did I do this? I know why I did this because it was the best thing at the time in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
circumstance.
So
Hmm.
the system led to the next iteration of the system, which led to the next iteration of the system,
Right.
and every molecule that moves is a change in the system in a way. And so how would you know the state of a system at a given time? It's like a ledger, like a Kafka ledger. Like everything is these immutable events, and you could maybe go back in time, but they're in large systems. They're just so complex. You could never really know what the system was at any given time.
Plus, if you weren't there, like this is something
Yeah.
when I hear my son talk about life when I was younger, and I'm like, but I was there. That's not what it's like. It feels like you're cherry picking. Oh no, data supports me. Like, but I was there. Like I kind of, and so the which I get, right? That if you're not in the context, it can be very hard to know what patterns and feedback loops, why would someone stay in a relationship, for example, that was unhealthy for them? Because at the time there was no other option. You're looking at that from a person with many options, at
Mhm.
somebody who did not have those options. And so that's a I think retrospecting is really, really, really important. That's how we see patterns. So I'm not for just go fast and break things with like no self awareness. I'm like, are we toddlers? We're just going to run around the house and break things. Like, I do think we want to have some discipline in our patterns, but simultaneously, too much of that, I think
There's some dangers to it
yeah,
that you
I
have to
get
be aware of.
stuck in it. I'm like, we used the way we used to do it. Get off my lawn, kids. You know, like that. I've gotten stuck in some of the mental models that I trusted, and I've brought them to teams later, and they didn't work at all. And of course, they didn't because it was I solved problems with this approach, but we don't have those same problems.
I
So
find it both dismaying and delightful when I discover something. I go, wait, this is part of my foundation and it doesn't work. And I've been living this way with carrying this thing on. So it's dismaying, but then delightful because I discovered a thing
Mm.
and now I have a choice.
that, exactly that. We put this systems thinking. Now I have a choice. Like that, that's like that. When once we get comfortable with, like, I love a good code review. I like a good help. Like, I love when my thinking is better because other people have helped me to see, right? So these things of organizationally looking for our blind spots, looking for those aha moments, creating space for them, those are the liberation moments, even though we roll our eyes and be like, now we have to do something different. But if we could have that experience of taking a deep breath when that happens, even though it's embarrassing and uncomfortable, but also like, my teammates can call me on things very easily and vice versa because they're not calling me on things. They care about me very much and value. But if something isn't working for us, it's not going to help us deliver the system. So if somebody's has a pain point, solving that pain point is going to open up some flow. Also, they're stuck for a reason usually. So I wish we had a more of a shared joyfulness of that discovery of I've been wrong about this all along, like completely wrong because it's
It's
that's
freeing.
yeah.
Yeah, it's liberating. Is that a good?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. We've taken so much of your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. I know you have a meeting to get to, and that was
Yeah,
amazing.
that was
That
great.
was pretty
Thanks.
mind blowing. So, thank you for helping us change our systems of thinking.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's you ask me to come and spend time with wonderful people talking about my favorite subject. It's really not like I'm really not being generous here. This is great for me and I'm so glad that I got to see you, meet you in person and talk about this. And I love the questions that you asked because I know it's what people are thinking. Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Diana.
Thank you.